we look at fashion as an ecology of interrelationships, then we could maybe also expand it and say, well, some people have really been left out of the interrelationships, or their contributions to the relationships have been ignored or devalued, right? Or even, purposefully hidden so that you're not acknowledging, right, the input of all of these indigenous knowledge systems. So trying to, see a broader array of humans as an interrelationship in the global fashion world, but also, right, other actors, non-human beings, different plant beings, right? Those could all be part of this more inclusive and, dare I say, decolonized or indigenized approach to ecological relationships in fashion.
Have you ever imagined fashion being as diverse as human culture? Have you ever dreamed of a respectful, ethical, and socially just fashion industry? Have you ever envisioned sustainability being at the core of the entire fashion system? This is your host, Laura Beltrán-Rubio. I'm a fashion curator, researcher, and educator. My mission is to translate scholarly insights into actionable strategies that we can all take to reshape how we create, wear, and think about fashion. So find a comfortable seat, brew some tea, and open your notebook as you join me in the quest for redressing fashion. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Redressing Fashion. I am very excited today to be talking with and interviewing an old Instagram friend of mine, but I think this is the first time we're actually having a live conversation, not mediated by Instagram. Georgia Ennis. I found out about you, I think, through actually an anthropologist friend who she saw your work as an anthropologist, but then she also found you on Instagram and she was like, you're gonna love this person. She shared your account with me and I've been following since, and we'll get to this throughout the next few minutes, but I'm very excited to be able to talk with you about plastic-free living, sustainable fashion, and I think importantly, ecological knowledge. And this is where it all ties with your research, which is still ongoing, and especially when it comes to, I think, fashion and textiles, it is still very much in process, and I am super excited to learn more about it and know more about it. So thank you, Georgia, for being here. I am very excited for this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's just such a pleasure to get to have this chance to share a little bit more about my research and my interest in sustainability and plastic-free living with you.
Thank you. I think we should get started. And I think the first question that I have, and this has slowly become the first question that I ask all of the guests, is how did your journey with fashion start, and how did you get to where you are today?
Thank you again. So my name is Dr. Georgia Ennis. I am an assistant professor of anthropology in the Anthropology and Sociology Department at Western Carolina University. I am an anthropologist, and I consider myself an anthropologist of many fields. So I am a linguistic and environmental, and then also what I consider a multimodal anthropologist, which is really an anthropology that works across multiple media forms and modalities. So that's really where some of my interest in things like fashion as well as social media come from. So I am really interested in both how people use social media for things like cultural revitalization and cultural valorization, as well as how it can be used to share anthropological research and make these kinds of more theoretical or academic kinds of concerns available to wider audiences. So interest in fashion, I was trying to think about how to answer this question. It really goes back to my childhood, I would say. I think a lot of us have childhood interests in style and fashion, and that those were things that I didn't always get the chance to pursue as an academic, especially as a junior scholar. But my late mother, was an artist, and she just had what I considered as a child the most amazing closet full of really interesting textiles and things that she had had collected throughout her life and career. So I always really enjoyed, playing in her closet. She was also someone that really enjoyed sewing. And so I grew up sewing and experimenting with fashion and with my personal style. But as a scholar, those were things that I didn't always find as much space for in academia. I'm not sure what your experience has been, but at least in my graduate program, things like fashion and style were sort of considered more women's interests, right? Even though there was a appreciation for culture and things like that. Fashion and clothing were never like as serious as, economics and exchange and other forms of material culture that could be more masculinely coded, especially kind of in terms of theory. So I definitely directed my graduate research more along lines that I thought would be theoretically rigorous and palatable within kind of this academic context where I found myself. And I really love the research that I did on language revitalization and community media, especially around questions of the methods and media that people bring to language revitalization in Indigenous communities, especially in the Ecuadorian Amazon, where I do collaborative work with media activists and Indigenous midwives. But I was also really struck by, while I was there doing this research, that people were not just interested in language, they were also interested in reclaiming and revitalizing their aesthetic practices, especially historical forms of dress and other kinds of ornamentation, using more traditional materials, so things that were sourced from the rainforest, like feathers and plant-based fibers, animal products, and beaded jewelry and seed-based jewelry, and all of these other kinds of aesthetic forms that had often been really discouraged by the settler colonial society that is actively oppressing Indigenous environmental practices and languages and other forms of knowledge. So my journey in fashion has, as sort of a theoretical or academic interest, has been a little bit longer and circuitous, but it also brings together, I think, my broader interests in sustainability and more sustainable lifestyle practices, which are really directly related as well to the research that I've done and the knowledge that has been shared with me by Amazonian Kichwa and other Indigenous peoples in the Ecuadorian Amazon.
Yeah, I think I love several things here. One is definitely how, and this is something that I have navigated myself, but I've also seen, I know of other friends and colleagues who have kind of arrived to fashion after taking a sort of long turn, also through these disciplines or fields or topics that are perceived as more serious in academia. So I, for example, arrived to fashion much earlier, but I arrived to fashion through economic history and through the trade of textiles, and that's how I got there. And then when I was pursuing graduate studies, by that time, I knew that I wanted to go to fashion. But it was weird, and it still is weird sometimes, in the sense that even though I consider myself a fashion historian and I do have a master's degree in fashion studies, I still struggle even to just present myself as a fashion historian, because I know that in certain circles especially it's not perceived as a serious enough discipline. And so my PhD is in art history, and I know that when I'm in certain spaces with certain type of art historians, I need to maybe say that I am a textile historian, or, well, I also study painted portraits a lot as well, so I use that too. And it's only in certain spaces, certain circles, that I feel kind of safer to say that I am a fashion historian and interested in fashion. So that's one side. And then the other side is, I think, how your story with your late mother, and, well, from reading your book, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but I know that there are other motherly figures in your life through which you have learned different fashion practices and ways of knowing around fashion as well. And I also find that interesting, because I do think, I definitely can identify with that myself, because my first relationship with fashion and with textiles was also through my grandmother and my mother. And I feel that this is, without wanting to essentialize or generalize, I do feel that as many women have these kind of matrilineal connections through textiles and through fashion that I also would say are worth just thinking about and maybe researching more thoroughly across cultures and across history and contexts as well.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that there is a shared experience for humans, but especially for women or sort of people in that gender role for this kind of transmission of knowledge through things like textiles and more embodied kinds of crafts and ways of knowing that have not always been captured in other kinds of archives. I'm thinking especially of Susan Strasser's really wonderful book, Waste and Want, which is all about the history of actually like trash and waste in the United States, and her observation that so much of that knowledge about how things were used and repaired and circulated was really part of the domain of women as often the primary kind of managers of households, but that when she went to do the research, she was kind of looking in, women's magazines and in letters and in these places that were not sort of part of the big histories that we often think of in terms of the nation state or the important figures, right, that everybody is aware of. So it's this really, I think, important strand of knowledge that people are trying to recapture and kind of identify in a lot of senses still.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing has to do with creating knowledge as well, right? And I think this is kind of implicit in, well, just your introduction, what I just mentioned, and then this last part about, I think, gender. I'm thinking about how there are these very specific, often like institutionalized sites where we believe that we create knowledge, but then there are these other spaces. And here you mentioned this in your introduction, and I want to go a little bit deeper into this topic, and is social media, right? Because I do think that social media nowadays, it's recognized by many people as a place where we can create and share knowledge in different ways. I think academia maybe is still trying to catching up with the idea of the internet and social media as a site for knowledge construction and dissemination and just sharing. But through your personal journey, I think social media has been an important part to share, especially your journey in sustainable living or plastic free living. Your handle is plastic free PhD. And again, well, I did mention in the introduction, this is how I found out about you. This is where we first met. I'm hoping we can be in person together soon somewhere, but this is really how this relationship started. And so I wanted to ask you about your social media activities, but then also what this plastic free living or plastic free lifestyle is for you, what it entails, and also what it means in a world where plastic is really everywhere.
That's a great question. And yeah, I have actually thought about changing my Instagram handle several times now, because I did start that account, I think probably back in right after I came back from finishing my primary fieldwork in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So sometime in 2017 to 2018. So it has been, a good 7 or 8 years of being the plastic free PhD. And in some ways, I think it's a little bit more limiting than what I'm interested in sharing completely, but it still unites a lot of the interests and commitments that I have. So I stick with it, and it is catchy and people like it. So when I came back from Ecuador, I had always been interested in the environment and environmental issues, but the time that I spent living in the Ecuadorian Amazon with indigenous Kichwa communities and in regions that were not as directly affected as some other parts of the Amazon by oil exploitation, but that nonetheless have all this infrastructure for oil that are really kind of shaping what people's lives are like and the access to space and to territory that they have. So the kind of the pipelines and the road systems all have really dramatically transformed people's lives. And so oil is something that is kind of always nearby, or the infrastructure for it is always present. And now as well, things like gold mining and deforestation are also major problems. At the time, oil was one of the bigger issues, with gold mining now kind of eclipsing it. But I really noticed that, there was this cycle where oil left the Amazon and was refined into gas, but also plastic products, right? And then those things returned in the form of packaged food and beverages, soda, some of the major multinational corporations that are huge plastic producers, all of those things. There's really nowhere for any of that plastic waste to go. And so people were facing a dramatic transformation in their kind of daily lives and the environment that they had access to, which was then driving them to consume all of these industrially produced products that would not have really been utilized in their households even a few decades ago, and certainly a few generations ago would have been really unknown to people. And those are also driving health problems. Things like diabetes and heart disease are growing problems for communities in the Amazon. So I saw this kind of link between the oil exploitation that a lot of indigenous communities are protesting, and then the consumption practices and the industrial products that were returning to them, right? And that they had nowhere to really dispose of. And so oftentimes families would, burn those plastic products on open fires in their living spaces, in their kitchens, or, would just throw them in the forest or in the river because there wasn't really anywhere else for them to go. And so, I don't blame people for not having, better access to waste disposal, right? That there's a lot of waste colonialism, and I think this is a manifestation of that. So I really became a lot more aware of plastic waste during that time. And when I came back to the US, I had an opportunity, I think, to think about my own consumption practices, to reflect on what I had learned and what people had shared with me, and the very seasonally based ways of living that were a lot more in tune with cycles of the environment and regeneration, and allowing the earth time to rest in terms of people's garden systems and other ways of interacting with the forest. So that's really where I became interested in living a more plastic-free lifestyle. I think that there is become more and more dissatisfied with some of those labels, because oftentimes I think it's just very clever marketing, and that is a good way to create consumer demand for quote unquote plastic-free products, which may or may not be actually that helpful or sustainable compared to their, plastic-based counterparts. So things I learned in the Amazon were about really reducing waste, but also reducing consumption, mending, being resourceful with the materials that you have available to you. So I have moved, I think, a little bit away from this, hardline plastic-free mindset. At the same time, I think there are all these, social justice issues and systemic issues around climate change and people's exposure to chemicals, where refineries and production facilities are located, that still make it really valuable to push against kind of our over-reliance on plastic, which can be a useful material, but is probably used in ways that are not always the most culturally adaptive, right? But they are maybe economically beneficial to some groups of people.
Thank you for this. And I think you're also pointing to the maybe nuances of some terms, and then also the dangers of some terms as well. So specifically when you talk about marketing, right? I think that there are a lot of terms, and it's not just plastic free, but there's ideas of circularity, for example. So circular fashion, or like circular economies, things like that. That's another term that I think has been used many times beyond what it's meant to be, and basically just as a marketing strategy or as an adjective that's attached to certain product, certain brand. But that doesn't really mean anything, and it doesn't mean anything unless we know exactly what it's trying to solve and what it's pointing to. So I think that's one of the issues. And then the other issue is with these systemic kind of structures. And actually, as you were speaking, especially about food, I was thinking of, and I can't remember their name right now, but it is an indigenous chef from North America. I'm sorry, I should know this. I just can't remember right now the name of this person. And he's very influential. And he's, I think, today one of the leaders of an indigenous food kind of movement. And he was mentioning this paradox of indigenous people technically knowing or having land-based knowledge in different things. In this case, it was food. And in the case of the Amazon, I think it is still one of the parts of the world where nature is just simply very rich there. There is a lot of resources. People and big enterprises from all over the world come to the Amazon to take out the resources. And yet the people who are there are the ones that have, in a way, less access to these resources, less access to their foodways and to knowledge about these foods. And then they are kind of confronted with the dark reality of having to eat all of these other foods, which aren't even healthy, in many cases don't even nourish their bodies as much as what they have around them because of the larger geopolitical structure of the world, which I would say, I mean, it is a form of colonialism even today. And so I think those contradictions are they are infuriating to me. I think they are also one of the reasons why I do this. And I know I'm now talking about food and not fashion, but I think that's the other thing. They are all connected. It's not like we can't separate all of these elements from one another.
Yeah, they're all part of our broader economic and production systems, and they interrelate with each other in so many ways that it's really hard to, completely pull them apart. And I think maybe part of our problem is that we do often see them as separate rather than trying to find some of those points of interconnection. But you could think about, for example, the cattle industry in the Amazon as one of the major drivers of climate change. But you then also have questions about, well, what do you do with all of the cow hides and the leather that comes out of that industry? Mm-hmm. And how are we going to have sustainable fashion systems that don't damage, both the environments, right, where they're producing food, but also the kind of raw materials for fashion. And of course, then you have questions about sort of animal welfare as well. So really all of these systems are really hard to pull apart, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then the other term that I think is very complex and also has been kind of co-opted by the system is sustainability. And this is what I would like to ask you about next, because I think sustainable fashion is related to plastic-free living, and plastic-free fashion in a way could be a form of sustainable fashion, but they are different things, right? So I would like to ask you what sustainable fashion, or maybe sustainability more broadly, means to you, and how it relates to this plastic-free living that you were just talking about.
Yeah, this is another great question. And, as an anthropologist, I think a lot about this concept of sustainability and what does it mean and how can we understand it? Because there are I think there is something that we can identify as sustainability, right? This idea that we don't have to take more than we need, that we could live in greater harmony with our natural systems and with the world and with each other without pulling more out of the earth than can be regenerated in a year, right? So thinking about sustainability in terms of a system, a cultural and a social system and an economic system that doesn't jeopardize the stakes of its own existence in order to continue functioning, right, might be one way that we can think about sustainability. As an anthropologist, I really think sustainability is something that is contextual and dependent on the context, and both, socially and historically contingent in a lot of ways. So there's no real one size fits all approach to what is sustainable in one time or place. And something that might be sustainable in one environment and one sort of kind of group of people and population size wouldn't work, when you had a larger group of people or a different sort of environment or technology system. So those are things that I talk a lot about with my students in terms of what sustainability is or could mean. And I think that oftentimes that does kind of just kind of get treated as another one of these green marketing terms where you're like, okay, sustainable fashion, I don't have to feel bad about being a consumer of this product because it's already sort of been taken care of for me. As a person that's interested in trying to live more sustainably and the connections to sustainable fashion, the way I approach it is thinking about how to extend the life of the things that I own, to be thoughtful about what I acquire in terms of both how it was made, what it's made from, the impacts it might have had in the past, and what it might have in terms of impacts in the future when it is maybe no longer in my possession, and trying to be more aware of the systems that brought things to me. And so that often looks like, in terms of plastic-free living, avoiding petroleum-based fabrics, so most synthetics made from petroleum, from fossil fuels, so things like polyester and spandex and nylon, which can have important applications, but also tend to be really overused in fast fashion and clothing that is designed to be disposable, even though the materials that it's made from are really never going to completely disappear or biodegrade. So trying to embrace more natural fibers, slow fashion, and then, as you know, I am a huge thrifter, and that's been one of the ways I've tried to approach a more sustainable wardrobe. We have enough. They say we have enough clothing on the planet to clothe, at least 6 or 7 generations, right? I'm not sure what the actual stats are, and sometimes those things don't really mean that much, but we do have just a huge amount of clothing. And I think finding ways to be creative and express your personal style with things that already exist and maybe have already received some love, and give them more love is a wonderful way to maintain sort of the value of products and to engage in a kind of new cultural movement to kind of reject the recent push to consumerism and overconsumption that we've really seen in the US and Europe since the 1950s and 1960s.
I love that you mentioned love because one of the ideas that I've been kind of playing with is, what if we reconstituted the value system in fashion to make it more about love and detachment? Right? Because the things that we love, we're not just going to discard them every month or whatever, or every week. We're going to want to keep them close. And so that's one of my ideas around it. I think there are others. There's also memory, which I think you also mentioned, and not just our own personal memory with clothes, but in the case of clothes that come from other people, I think there's also a longer kind of memory, a longer history that we could talk about. And in general, I think a lower approach to fashion, which I think that's one of the things that I admire the most about you as a thrifter, or what I've been able to see on social media as a thrifter, because it's not just about going to the thrift shops and buying second-hand things there, but sometimes I see you posting like, oh, I found, I don't know, this lamp that I've been looking for years. And that, I think, to me, has become also a slow, maybe even a collector's approach to thrifting, which I think is also important. And I think it's also necessary now, because we have, in a way, I think, become so accustomed to fast, and not just fast fashion, but like fast living. We need everything to kind of be immediately available. And we also need to be able to like have things just on hand all the time. That thrifting, I think, has become just an extension of that just fast cycle of consumption, right? And many people thrift now, but they go thrift and then the cycle's short, and then they get rid of the clothes or whatever it is that they're thrifting, and they go again. And so the cycle continues on and on and on. And I'm not really sure that that's necessarily a solution to the problem, because we just need to slow down consumption, and perhaps even stop consumption as much as we can. And so I wanted to ask about your specific approach to thrifting in relationship maybe to this slowness, but also in general. Yes, your approach to the secondhand market, to thrifting, to not falling in this fast cycles of consumption?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I think we all have, at least if you are, on a certain side of the algorithm, have probably gotten at least one or two thrift haul videos where it is basically the same as any other sort of fast fashion haul where someone has purchased, 20 items of clothing and is just cycling through all of these new and exciting outfits. And I think it does create some of the same psychological, like fear of missing out or desire, that sort of inadequacy that drives so much of our consumption practices, or at least, my sort of personal feelings around why do I need to go and like buy these things, right? Capitalism is a system that makes you feel like if you just buy this next thing, this next outfit, a new pair of shoes, that you will have suddenly fixed yourself and be this better person. And it's sort of that dream that we are taken in by. And so, just as a kind of personal approach, I do try to avoid watching too many of those videos. I'm very inspired by other thrifters, but I have found that it does actually, kind of increase my desire to go thrifting and to buy new things and to feel like my closet isn't good enough, even though I have pieces in it that I have looked for a long time and I feel are really special. And so, yeah, just trying to be more present in what I have and appreciative of what I have is, I think, a big part of it. It's a cliche, right? But it's a cliche for a reason that comparison is the thief of joy in a lot of senses. And so trying to be happy in the things that I have collected with love and care over the years is a big part of that. I do also have strategies to, we're all subject to these kind of impulses and systems that are really designed to encourage us to overshop and overspend. So when I have the urge to buy something, I will write it down. And if it is still there with me in a month or two, then I know maybe it is something I actually want and I should really start looking for when I'm out shopping or thrifting. I do go thrifting pretty often because you never know what you're going to find. And that is how you find really special pieces, is by being the kind of a regular visitor. But I've also gotten a lot better at appreciating things and taking pictures of them and then leaving them behind for someone else who will perhaps have more space in their life to appreciate them. Because I do think that I have a little bit too much right now and probably need to engage more in moving things out of my life and in doing a little bit of reselling or, consciously donating or upcycling and finding new uses for some of the things that I've acquired, because I have many treasures and it's probably time to share them with some other people.
You're making me think. I am doing some style coaching now, and I have a recent client who basically came up with this term of doing field trips to the thrift shops. And she's like, sometimes I just need to see myself just wearing something different, something crazy. And so she goes to these stores and she just tries things on and she takes photos and she shares the photos, but then she doesn't, like, there's no buying allowed. And so that's why she calls it field trips, because it's a sort of experimentation in, like, how can I look different, how can I feel different, how is it going to make me have fun for a day, but then not engaging consumption. That I do think that strategy can be a little dangerous, because it is easy, like, once you're there, it is easy for you to start buying, especially if you're trying it and you like how it looks. So it can be dangerous. But I also think there is definitely something about the maybe emotional effects of novelty in a way, and just going out and trying things and feeling beautiful, that can also perhaps be enhanced in a way by just trying on clothes. So I think if you're disciplined enough, maybe this can work. But yeah, it's all, and then the fact that it's also a practice, right? So to become a better thrifter, you do need to go and, like, develop these other kind of embodied skills around clothes and around textiles, which we have lost, really, I think, as humans. And centuries ago, and maybe not even centuries, like probably less than a century ago, even in Western Europe, even in North America, I think a lot of people had more material knowledge of clothes and of textiles than we do today. And I think that's also maybe one of the problems, I think, with sustainability now, and especially with plastic free, as you were saying. A lot of people don't know how to read a label. A lot of people don't know how to identify synthetic fabrics or synthetic materials. And so I think that's also a big problem.
Yeah, and I think there's just been this kind of general de-skilling of the population in terms of how, how to identify fabrics and what different fabrics are good for, but also around how to care for the things that we own and, how to mend things. I've been working on darning and other forms of repair as skills over the last few years. And those are just things that we don't really learn in school anymore, so we don't really have access to a lot of that knowledge that was so much more widespread, I think, in the past.
Yeah, and unexpectedly, because I thought I was gonna have to just take a huge leap, but I think this idea of knowledge, and especially knowledge that is maybe being lost in some ways, can lead us to your book. So you recently published your first book, Rainforest Radio. It is amazing. I read it. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I learned also a lot from it, which is something that I must say I was kind of expecting, because this is not my field. But at the same time, I ended up having a lot of questions about fashion, which perhaps was what I wasn't expecting. But, well, first of all, congratulations as a fellow scholar working currently on my first book. I know how big of a project this is. And I can also feel, or I think I can also imagine how exciting it must be to finally have your book printed and on hand and being distributed to readers. So congratulations. And
thank you so much.
I would like to ask you about the book. What is the book about?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it is a big weight off my shoulders to finally have it done and out in the world. I did the research that it was based on 10 years ago. So it, has been in process for a while now, but it is actually, a fairly good turnaround for an anthropology book to be out within a decade. So I'm proud of myself. And it was really wonderful to actually be able to take it back to Ecuador this summer and share it with some of the people that it is about and who are featured in it. And hopefully I will also finally be able to translate it into Spanish in the next few years. Yeah. That's the kind of the next goal. So it's published, but now I need to do some more work, which is always a good problem to have. So my book is called Rainforest Radio, Language, Community Media and Language Reclamation in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And it is a exploration of grassroots and community-based approaches to the revitalization or reclamation of Napo Kichwa, which is a dialect of Amazonian Kichwa that's spoken in Napo, Ecuador, around the towns of Tena and Archidona, and then in several more rural communities where I did my research. And it is about how language change in the Ecuadorian Amazon is connected to broader processes of colonialism in the Amazon, especially things like environmental disruption, but also missionization and the territorial displacement and settlement that Indigenous people are continuing to face. And so I try to look at the environment, at the people's language practices, as well as their media practices. So the kind of bridge between my interest in social media and my research is trying to understand how people use participatory media, things like social media, but also in the case of my book, radio and beauty pageants and other kinds of performance as ways of transmitting their cultural memories and their cultural traditions and their ongoing kind of cultural vitality, right, in the face of a lot of pressure, pushing them towards more Western or European linguistic practices, as well as lifestyles and food ways and ways of knowing. So I work really closely with media activists, as well as especially a group of Indigenous midwives called Amupakin, or the Association of Kichwa Midwives of the Upper Napo, who are a women's health and cultural performance organization. So the book is really looking at the work of all of these people to try and revitalize Kichwa and transmit it to new generations, and also strengthen its importance and value and continue to speak it.
Thank you. Well, I think I have two questions. I'm going to go with the first one, which I think is maybe more basic, and then I'm going to move into the second one. And it's the fact that I really only discovered very recently that your research is also about fashion. Yes, and about, I think, textile knowledge and dress and bodily adornment, bodily comportment in different ways. And this is something that I mentioned it earlier. I have been following you on social media for years now. And it's not just following. I do think that we have, engaged in conversation. It's, we have built a relationship around social media. And I think only until I invited you to the podcast, basically, I realized that your research also has to do with fashion and textiles. So that, I think, is the first part of the question. Can you tell us more about the role that textiles and women's knowledge around textiles also connects with ecological knowledge in the Amazon, and with this broader theme of language and cultural knowledge and survival?
Yeah, that's really kind of one of the important bridges in my work, or one of the kind of main insights of my work or contributions of my work, is trying to link questions of language revitalization to broader cultural forms or aesthetic practices. So as I mentioned at the beginning, my interest in fashion didn't always feel like the most serious or academic sort of pursuits. And so I was focused a lot more on questions of language in terms of language structure and language standardization, and a whole lot of stuff that maybe is not as interesting for your audience. But when I was actually working with people, collaborating with people in the Amazon, I found that they were focused on all these embodied practices, on recreating traditional forms of dress that are not really widely utilized on a daily basis for most people. Most Indigenous people in the Amazon wear Western street clothes on a kind of a daily basis, but still in performance settings and cultural revitalization events and weddings and sort of ceremonial rituals, people were still drawn to these more traditional or historical styles of dress. And so I touch on that a bit in the book, and that was one of the big revisions I made between my dissertation and the book, was to pursue more of this interest and kind of research into women's dress and women's knowledge around textiles, because that was one of the real kind of emphases that people in Napo had in creating media and in public performances. So I will lean down here and pick up some of my props. So one of the things that I do a lot of research on is this fiber that's called pita, which is made from the leaves of a really large bromeliad. Men and women know how to produce the fiber, but it's especially something that is connected to women's knowledge, especially in terms of song and oral traditions and storytelling. So this is a product that is really historically significant. It was extracted as tribute by the Spaniards from indigenous populations in the region, kind of from the start of the colonial period. And it's also something that people use to weave or hand knot these really amazing bags that they make for use in the rainforest and for daily life. And so these are, if you go hunting or you go gathering, you have your what's called a shigra to carry your things with you, and they're all made from this really labor intensive plant fiber that women produce from start to finish, from harvesting the leaves and then really processing it and spinning it into a 2-ply cordage, and then finally going through all the steps of weaving it. So this was one of the things I became really interested in, especially with the research that I did with the midwives of Amupakin, as well as the woman that I lived with, who was one of the motherly figures that we mentioned at the start of our conversation. Her name was Serafina Grefa. She also passed away a few years ago, but she was known really well in Napo for her knowledge of pita production and of weaving shigra and of weaving very fine and delicate shigra bags. And, I have since she tried to teach me, and I never really learned because I was more focused on my research. And that was one of the big regrets of my life, really, that I didn't learn more from her. But the women of Amupakin have been very generously helping me this last year learn more of these skills and how to make pita and how to weave the shigra. And I have to tell you, it is much harder than it looks. Every stage of the process is incredibly challenging. And for women to be so fast and so precise in their production of these kinds of netted bags it's just incredible. So that's one of the things I'm still kind of focusing on now, and some new work that I'm doing with Amupakin around collaborative social media production with the goal of cultural revitalization and cultural valorization. So yeah, it's been kind of a long process, but I think that my interest in fashion really brings together some of these longer term questions I've had about women's knowledge, about the transmission of ecological knowledge in disrupted environments, and the ways that people are trying to recapture and reclaim these more traditional forms of craft and skill that still exist, right? And that they want to preserve and see new generations continue to utilize and even transform, right? And bring in new sorts of ideas and ways of bringing them forward. It's a really exciting and also sometimes heartbreaking thing to be focused on in the work that I do with women in the Amazon.
And actually in the book, you do have some recorded conversations or transcribed conversations with Serafina herself, and I think I can't remember the name of the other woman, Olga, I believe, where they explain some of the processes in processing and threading the pita and then weaving the shigras. And I think just there, and even though the processes in a way are summarized, because you do mention also the importance of not just telling people how to do things, but showing how to do it, which I think is the embodied side of these textile knowledges. And so the book only contains, I suppose, the verbal part of it, not the embodied part of it. But even there, I think you can see how labor intensive the process is, and then also how slow it is, right? I think that we return to that slowness of fashion. And actually a couple of episodes ago in the podcast, I had another conversation with Nia de Groot, who is Guinea, and they were also talking about slowing down and slowness, and this, I think, paradigm of a slower living in general that is shared by Indigenous communities, I think, but also in a way it's that's how humans in different cultures were years ago, before this increasingly fast-paced life that we've designed and embraced and adopted. And I don't know, I've been thinking about slowness more because I do feel that there is some attraction towards a slower way of living now. It feels like everyone is overwhelmed and burnt out, and so people are starting to dream about slower lifestyles. I'm hoping that has positive implications for sustainability and other things, but honestly, who knows?
Yeah, I feel like it's a complicated question, because so much of our idealization of slower lifestyles tends to be maybe an overly romanticized version, or one that's based in extreme class privilege that is really inaccessible to a lot of people, and so remains always a sort of a fantasy that we're stuck in if you sort of think about Weber, right, and we are stuck in the iron cage of work, and we've lost sort of that, the species being. I'm mixing all of my old scholars, but I think you maybe see what I'm getting at, right? This kind of sense that we do want to return to some of these ways of living that have been taken from us in a lot of senses through capitalism and the spread and the kind of unavoidable economic system system in which we are all increasingly enmeshed. And, Indigenous people in the Amazon are also enmeshed in this economic system. And I found that they also felt nostalgia for slower times and slower ways of living that, was no longer available to them because of the hustle and bustle of the city and the, arrival of all of the wage labor and missionary schools and all of these kind of industrial processes that kind of surround all of us these days. That kind of longing and that nostalgia, I think, is there for many of us.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. The other question that I had that I was thinking about is about the ecology, because I think in your book you write about languages and ecology and how we should consider language revitalization through this ecological system. And I think an ongoing thought that I had in reading your book had to be with what would happen if we considered fashion, like the contemporary fashion system, as an ecology as well. Because I think it has been thought of as a sort of ecosystem, but I think the ecosystem is still very much within the kind of capitalist paradigm. So my question was like, what happens if we think about it as an ecology, and then also what happens when we think about it as an ecology, especially in processes of revitalization or even just like diversity within fashion? Because I think there are many cultures that, as you just told us about the people of the Upper Napo, they dress in this kind of cosmopolitan, for lack of a better word, dress that is kind of imported from North America. And this happens to many Indigenous people and many people of different cultures really around the world. And there are many reasons for it, but I do think that this has led to a sort of flattening of culture and flattening of fashion practices that doesn't necessarily do justice to the world's cultural diversity. And so yes, I don't think I'm framing this question very eloquently.
It's a great question. Yeah.
Okay.
It gives me so many things to think about. I immediately think of sort of where I draw a definition of ecology, which is from the Indigenous ecological philosopher Kyle Powys Whyte, who talks about ecologies as qualities of interrelationships between different beings. And so he's really trying to base this in more of a indigenous understanding of ecology. So between humans and non-human beings and spiritual beings and landscape features and, animacy in the natural world. So trying to see, not just sort of our European understanding of ecology, Western perspective on it in terms of the biotic and abiotic processes or entities that interact in an environment, right, or in an ecosystem. And so I think if we look at fashion as an ecology of interrelationships, then you could maybe think about how I really love the ways you've been trying to point out that what we think of as fashion is really dominated by Euro-American aesthetics and centers of power, and often leaving. And so I think if we look at fashion as an ecology of interrelationships, then you could maybe think about how to read kind of against the archive and trying to see people's aesthetic practices and traditions, right, and within the documentation that does exist, right, in terms of art history and other kind of archival sources. So if we sort of think about fashion as this ecology of interrelationships, then we could maybe also expand it and say, well, some people have really been left out of the interrelationships, or their contributions to the relationships have been ignored or devalued, right? Or even, purposefully hidden so that you're not acknowledging, right, the input of all of these indigenous knowledge systems. Most of my students have no idea that one of the real places in the world that red dye came from was Mexico, prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, and that there was this amazing textile industry and that people were able to produce all of these amazing colors just with, plants and other kind of natural products. And so trying to, see a broader array of humans as an interrelationship in the global fashion world, but also, right, other actors, non-human beings, different plant beings, right? Those could all be part of this more inclusive and, dare I say, decolonized or indigenized approach to ecological relationships in fashion. And so that might be a more hopeful direction for us to go in.
I'm excited to think more about this and maybe have more conversations about this. So the next question, and I think it has to do with a little bit of what you were saying about your research and, well, especially where you're drawing your frameworks in a way from and your definitions from, especially when it comes to Indigenous cultures, Indigenous subjects that you are studying. And like me, we do research about Indigenous cultures and subjects, but we are not Indigenous ourselves. And I think there might be a lot of people like us around the world. And I think increasingly there are people like us around the world who want to pursue these research subjects, but also I think we are standing on very exploitative academic and research traditions, and we are trying to kind of reframe the way in which research is done. And we're trying to, more than researchers, become allies. I also consider myself personally an activist for Indigenous people, Indigenous culture. And so how do you ensure that your research is not purely extractive and that it actually serves the communities that are most directly involved with it, and that kind of foregrounds actually the community interests and their welfare and well-being?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's, I think, a really important one that people are continuing to try and grapple with and think about, and one that has been really important in my work as well. So as an anthropologist, there's a really fraught relationship between anthropology and Indigenous peoples, and I am a non-Indigenous anthropologist. I am a, white Euro-American person of settler descent who has lived on Indigenous territories for my whole life and was not always as aware of what that history meant. And so I've been incredibly fortunate to have mentors and teachers and professors in both academic and non-academic settings who have really generously shared a lot of their time and knowledge with me and helped me understand more about what those relationships do mean and could mean, and what possibilities there might be for me to continue to engage, or maybe engage in more equitable or collaborative ways. So especially in my dissertation research, I wanted to pursue collaborative work with Indigenous communities in the Amazon. I speak Amazonian Kichwa. I've been studying Kichwa since 2012 and Amazonian Kichwa since 2013. And I continue to go back to the communities where I've worked and to share the products of my research with them and to write collaboratively with the women that I work with in the midwifery organization. So I definitely don't claim to be perfect, and I know that I've made mistakes in my research, but I've also received a lot of grace from people that I'm really thankful for. So I think that, in my own work, how I've approached it, and especially as I've moved through my academic career, and I'm, still untenured faculty, but I have more freedom and sort of flexibility in how I approach things to really design research projects that answer questions that are important to the people that I'm working with and are not just sort of my own esoteric academic kind of concerns, and trying to find ways that we can collaborate that are mutually beneficial or, more beneficial to them than they are to me. I, have an academic job. I really love being a college professor, and those are things that are possible for me because of the work that I have done and the access that people have given me to their lives and experiences. And so I really try to approach that with humility and to be grateful for it, and to do work that I think supports their causes and the things that they are asking me for, even if they might not be the things that always move my career forward in the most direct way. And so that can mean not publishing things that I've been asked not to publish. And I do a lot of writing right now or thinking around Audra Simpson's concept of refusal, and then trying to bring that into linguistics research, thinking about refusal to participate in language documentation or sort of other forms of practice, or not wanting those things to be public, which are a big requirement for a lot of research grants. And so trying to listen to the people and respect the limits that they place on how their knowledge can be circulated, but also maybe find ways that we can transmit their stories and their voices, hopefully more respectful and equitable ways that are not just extractive, but let them tell their stories from their perspectives with a little bit of support and, maybe financial or technological, right? And just kind of get out of their way and let them do their thing. So I've been really fortunate to have these relationships, and I really don't take them for granted. So I hope that they're things that my students are able to take away from working with me that they can also bring into the work that they hope to do in the future as well.
These are great tips, and I'm left especially thinking about the concept of refusal, which this is something that we do in research all the time. You kind of filter the information that you're putting out in different ways and for different reasons. And so just recentering in a way community interests in that filtering of information in a way, or like processing of information, I think is one of the key things that I think we have to learn to navigate too, because you also mentioned there are some expectations or some ideas. And so yeah, that's, I suppose, part of the process. The other question also about your research, but I think kind of bringing it back full circle to social media, has to do with the more practical aspects in which you connect your research as an anthropologist and as, well, I suppose, a linguist as well, with your plastic-free lifestyle, with sustainable fashion or sustainable living. How do you kind of bring the two together? And I think we have discussed a little bit about it throughout the podcast, but to sum it up, what would you say?
There's a Haitian anthropologist who's very well known, Michel Roth-Trujillo, who says something to the effect that, as anthropologists, we have seen firsthand that there are other and better ways of living, and that perhaps this social system that we have that sees, a continuous growth and economic development is not the only way to live, and not even the most kind to each other and to the planet. I'm really roughly paraphrasing it there, but this is the idea that I really come back to in terms of, what anthropology does for me and what it really how it links to my interest in sustainability and environmentalism. That I've had the privilege, the really unique privilege, I think, of spending a lot of time with Indigenous communities in the Amazon, and have been able to learn from them and have seen that there are other ways of treating each other and treating the planet, and seeing, the world as not just something to be extracted, but as something to be respected and cared for reciprocally. And those are stories that I think are important to transmit, and something that, even if I'm trying to be respectful of Indigenous knowledge by not sharing their stories directly, like I'm not an Indigenous person, I don't want to appropriate that knowledge in my social media presence, which is often why I don't talk about all of the research that I do online, because, they are making their own social media. and are telling their own stories. And like, I don't need to be the one to do that, but I'm still really informed by the relationships that I have with people, the priorities that they have shown to me, and the ways of, relating and being involved in community and committed to communal pursuits that I think are really valuable lessons for people more broadly, right? That can be part of the things that I try to share.
I think I may follow Amupakin on Instagram. I'm not entirely sure, but I think I do. And if not, maybe I've seen posts that maybe you have reshared.
They're a special group of ladies. So if anybody wants to support, me, I would actually really ask them to go and follow Amupakin. I shared the links to their Instagram and TikTok and website with you. And we've been working collaboratively on a project for the last 6 months or so, but it's been something we've been dreaming of doing for a lot longer, to have intergenerational social media production where the elders work with the younger apprentices of the organization to document some of their knowledge of things like pita and midwifery and plant medicine and food ways and all of the kind of interrelated knowledge, and then share that more widely. So if people are interested in supporting Indigenous women in the Amazon, they would love to have some more followers and support that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. I will definitely be following, and I'll share the links in the show notes for anyone who wants them to be able to access them more easily. And so lastly, to finish, I like ending the episodes with 3 little things. They can be 3 kind of takeaways, like the main insights. They can also be actionable strategies, in this case, to maybe embrace plastic-free living. Which would be, I think, your 3 little things that you would like our listeners to enter this with or leave with?
My first tip is to start where you are if you want to start living more sustainably or to embrace a plastic-free lifestyle. So conducting an audit of your waste and just seeing what kind of trash you're producing can be really eye-opening. So just, kind of saving your plastic trash for a week or a month and seeing what's there is a great archaeological exercise that everybody can engage in, and then maybe make some decisions about 1 or 2 easy things that you could maybe try and find alternatives for or avoid in some other way. So really easy things are using your reusable bags at the grocery store. I know that that's such a simple one, but it really does make a difference in how much kind of plastic bags you collect over the course of the year. And things that surprise people: chewing gum is actually made of food grade plastic inner tubing. So you could just probably stop chewing gum and avoid a lot of microplastics in your daily life. And also, in terms of your wardrobe, switching to more sustainable fibers or to more natural fibers as your clothes wear out and are no longer mendable and it's time to replace them. So, slowing down and being more aware of what you've got. My second tip is to not chase perfection. I wasted a lot of time feeling bad that I was not, as plastic free as people as I saw on the internet. And that was, again, comparison was the thief of joy, because I was still doing a lot and had made significant changes in my life. But it is really impossible in our current economic and production system to be entirely plastic free. So don't chase perfection. And third, also don't lose sight of the system and the broader structures that are connected to plastic. So your individual behaviors maybe don't make the biggest difference, but they are important for you. But pursuing questions of extended producer responsibility laws, thinking about where new oil refineries or production facilities are located, ending oil and gas subsidies. These are like bigger questions that could really make broader changes for not only you as an individual, but the people around you. So start where you are, don't be perfect, and think about the broader structures.
Thank you. Well, Georgia, I would like to end with a testimonial because I have definitely been influenced by you. It sounds simple, but one of the things that I've started doing since following you is that I think I noticed that you went out for like dinner or something one night and you brought back the leftovers in your own reusable containers instead of getting the boxes from the restaurant or whatever. And so that's one of the things that I've started to do. I just have, whenever I'm going out and I know it's going to be a big meal, I just have a container with me. And the other thing is, especially when I was teaching, that I was going to university and sometimes I ended up eating out, I would bring my own cutlery as well to avoid using the disposable ones. And it is a minor change, really, if you think about it. It doesn't require a lot of effort, maybe just remembering to bring them, but that's it.
You know, if you just have like a little to-go bag with your, you know, reusable fork and a reusable cup or jar and some sort of storage container. You know, I've got a cute stainless steel tiffin, but an old Tupperware or whatever is just as good, and you can bring stuff home and avoid styrofoam and other kinds of plastic that are, you know, never going to be recycled and are really in use just one time, but will be in a landfill for a lot longer. And also had all of this history, right? The oil came from someplace, and all of the production affected other people in its journey to you. So keeping those things in mind and being just a little slower, more present, I think can really get us a lot further in the world. I'm glad that it's glad I've influenced you. Thank you for telling me that.
Yes, absolutely. More than one way for sure. Well, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your generosity with your time, your insights. I will definitely post Amupakin's information to follow them. I would also say that anyone interested in learning more about Georgia's research and plastic-free living should also follow her, not just Amupakin. And yes, I'm very excited to learn more about your ongoing projects, your ongoing research. And as I mentioned earlier, I hope that we can finally translate this friendship into an in-person gathering someday.
I know, that would be so much fun. I might have to sign up for your Mexico City trip because I do love Mexico City and I would love to see what you all have planned. So we'll see.
Yes, that would be great. Yes, we are planning a couple of trips, fashion history trips, one to Mexico City and the other one to New Orleans. And I'm sure there will be more. Maybe we can plan one to the Amazon as well.
Yeah, I would love that. A pizza workshop would be amazing. Well, thank you so much for this.
That would be amazing.
Thank you so much for this chance to speak with you. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation. We should do this again some other time, maybe not on video.
Yes, absolutely. I would love that. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And I...